Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Before we get started with today's show, we want to thank everyone who took the Politics Guys listener survey. There were a bunch of you, and we haven't quite gotten around to collating and analyzing all the results yet, but that's going to happen, and it will definitely help us expand and improve the show. So thanks very much for that. And speaking of surveys, a team of researchers from Stony Brook University have asked us to help them study the messages that political parties send to their members. The survey is confidential and it only takes a few minutes to finish. Now, the link is one of these really long things, but I will post it in the show notes. So if you'd be willing to do that, that would be great. Help the advancement of science, political science, that sort of thing, Also, they asked if you do take the survey that you not post about it in the comments section of our Facebook discussion so you don't, influence other people who haven't taken it. Thanks very much. All right, so we start today's show with the story that's dominated the news all week, the aftermath of the tragic shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. What some argue makes this different from other school shootings, far too many of them, is that a lot of the students have organized politically, hoping to put pressure on state government in Florida, which, by the way, has some of the most permissive gun laws in the country. In 2017, for instance, Guns and Ammo ranked it the 12th best state for gun owners. And they're also hoping to pressure the federal government to take the sort of significant action that hasn't been taken after so many other of these school shootings. And while President Trump hosted a listening session with a number of students, some conservative commentators were actually wondering whether the students were being used as, I guess you call it emotional pawns in what they sometimes call the left's battle to eviscerate the Second Amendment. We'll get to that in just a minute, I'm sure. But in terms of policy proposals, President Trump has directed the Justice Department to move forward with a regulation banning bump stocks, those devices that can turn a semi-automatic weapon into really the equivalent of a full automatic, though he's resisted calls to ban AR-15s and other assault-style weapons that have been, used so very often in these shootings. And he's also come out against active shooter training in schools, calling it crazy and too hard on the kids. But he seems to be favoring arming a significant percentage of teachers, somewhere between 10 to 40%, though honestly, Jay, to me, this feels much more like an off-the-cuff idea than a real policy proposal. And, more plausible proposals the president seems to endorse, at least for now, because gosh knows he's a changeable guy, are improvements to the background check system and possibly a raised age limit for buying certain weapons. And, of course, all of this coincided with the annual Conservative Political Action Committee, or CPAC, conference, at which featured speaker Wayne LaPierre, the president of the NRA, really lashed out, and in some instances to great applause, at those who are calling for firearm restrictions. He talked about the shameful politicization of tragedy by the left, arguing that they, meaning the left, of course, hate individual freedom, they don't care about our school children, and they want to make all of us less free. So there's a lot to chew on there. Jay, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about, what's happened this week? Any policy changes you think might be coming? And what, if anything, you'd like to see come of this?
Well, again, as I always preface most of my statements, it doesn't so much what I think. What I'm trying to do is sort of be a prism for the conservative views that are out there, and sort of again explain and discuss those views, where they come from and why they're there, and then look at the policy and what might happen next. So with that in mind, I think the bump stock issue, I think that's a winner all the way around. The NRA doesn't have any serious objection, from what I understand, to making bump stocks, regulating them as these other class 1 firearm, machine gun type things that there's already a regulatory system in place. It's just adding them to that. I think that is a common sense solution that everyone can get behind. The age requirement, my sense from that is that most conservatives and most commentators said that that's really sort of a cosmetic. Um, how much of a difference it wouldn't have stopped, for example, the Columbine shooters going way back. It wouldn't have stopped. Um, I believe Adam Lanza was again stole the weapons from her mother. The evidence shows that for the most part, most of these younger shooters get the weapons illegally. Now, this wasn't the case in this situation, but I don't know that as if the goal is to really prevent mass shootings. I don't know that the age limit does a whole lot for that. Um, so, setting that aside, now the assault weapons ban, that's the next piece of this, and I know our listeners are very smart and very bright, and they know that when the term assault weapon is used, that's really sort of an imprecise term. There was the assault weapons ban back in 94 to 99, where a classification of weapons were banned, and they were called assault weapons, but that definition didn't have anything really to do with their firepower capacity. It was more a cosmetic labeling based on non-firepower. So setting that aside, I will just in the interest of making easier, I'll still refer to as assault weapons, but I don't know where we go on that, because there is a certain appeal to saying, well, let's ban these because there's a common sense thing of, well, look, nobody who really needs one of these, right? It's not something you need for hunting. It's not something you need for personal protection. And there is a big piece of the populace who looks on it that way and says, let's ban them because nobody really needs them. There's another segment of the population, though, and this is the segment that is often ignored, and I think you referred to it a couple weeks ago as sort of the gun culture, and maybe we need a better word for it because that sounds kind of ugly, but again, that's the word we have right now, so let's call it a gun culture out there that says, well, look, this is a legal weapon to buy. I've got one. I like it. I like having AR-15s, assault weapons. I'm not causing anyone any harm, so stay out of my business. And there's that sense, and I think so often the folks in cities and the coastal elites, as it were, just don't understand that mindset. That look, here's something that people are using, possessing legally, have had for years legally. And the government wants to take it away from them. I think that's just a huge hurdle that we need to get over, because it's sort of, again, two completely different cultures, as it were, sort of trying to talk to each other on this. Did I hit it all? I didn't talk about the background check system. I think there's really hope for big improvements on the background check system, because that's something that Republicans and the NRA can get behind, have pushed for a long time, and Democrats would be hard pressed not to say let's have better background check systems. I think the game plan might be, well, we'll trade better background check systems for upping the age limit and assault weapon bans or something like that. But that's a, again, strategic question down the road.
Well, there's a lot there, Jay. I guess a couple of things I want to say. Obviously, you're right about the assault weapons thing, but I guess I would also point out that, certainly we don't want to ban weapons based on cosmetics. That doesn't make any sense at all. But it also seems to me that a big part of the problem is weapons that you can, large magazines where you can just basically, pull the trigger a bunch of times very quickly and kill a lot of people. And so I would say I would argue it's more of a large capacity magazine issue than anything else. Of course, the problem with that is there are already so many of those out there, and that's so much more difficult to police and monitor that I don't know if there's a good solution to that, certainly, you know.
And I think that the conservative response, the pro gun response, typically to the magazine argument is, look, in most of these cases, magazine size wouldn't have been a factor because the shooter has plenty of time to reload. Even if you have smaller magazines, if you have time to reload, because you're essentially shooting at unarmed targets, that is going to be less of a factor. But I get that, and I get the idea that, look, if you are there's less of an argument to say I need to have this massive magazine to shoot, get them all. These are in many cases weapons designed for fighting in a war, fighting an army. I mean, it's different than certainly hunting or what you typically think of as self-defense.
Yeah, and there's one thing in your initial response that I think you didn't address that should be addressed. There's actually, I don't know how significant it is, but there's a not insignificant percentage of the population who would say you're missing something very important. And this isn't about hunting. This isn't about self-defense. I mean, I've talked to some of these people saying that, no,
Sure.
we need these weapons because we need to defend ourselves against the government.
It's the preservation of liberty. Yes.
And I mean, and this is not, some coastal elites or non-coastal elites, as liberal elites as maybe I am, I don't know, might say, well, that's just some nuts. But no, I mean, I know a number of highly intelligent, well-educated people, who absolutely fundamentally believe that this is the main reason why they need AR-15s and why they need big magazines and that sort of thing. So when the government becomes, the government which is teetering on the brink of being tyrannical now, in their view, when they get pushed over that brink, well, then they're going to need to defend themselves. And this is what they're going to do with it. And now, to me, that's bonkers. But on the other hand, I get it because I feel that especially from certain elements of the right, there's been really a campaign for the last 20 or so years to sow distrust in government. And I think that's certainly been very effective. Now, I don't think they're doing it because I'll just say, I don't think they're doing it. They did it because they hate the country or anything like that. It was just a political strategy, but it's a political strategy with some hugely unfortunate repercussions.
Yeah, I would agree with you on, look, that sentiment is out there, and I'd also agree that for me personally, I think you were saying bonkers. I think that's the way I would look at it also. But you're right. I know plenty of people who are not in and of themselves bonkers, who hold to that, and believe whether or not it's I'm going to need this weapon in an armed struggle against the government. There's the sense that my being able to own this weapon keeps the government honest, so to speak. It is a check against tyranny. And look, there's historical purposes or historical. This goes way back to our founding, that we were concerned about tyranny of the federal government. So, that's out there, and those people you are not going, and those people I guess would fall into my, if I were to be like Hillary, a basket of I don't think they're deplorable at all, but the basket of people who see this as, hey, I've got this right to do this. I'm doing it. I'm not hurting anybody by doing it. Leave me the hell alone. And that's a big, that's out there. I'm sorry.
Another thing I wanted to point out is one thing, and I posted this on Facebook. The remarks by Wayne LaPierre, arguing that people on the left hate individual freedom. They don't care about our school children, and they want to make all of us less free. That's the sort of thing, and I don't care whether it comes from the left or the right. And there are people on the left who'd say that gun owners who aren't willing to give up their guns, for instance, must want children to die. And
Right.
that's
Well,
the
there
sort
have
of
been
rhetoric
plenty
that just
who have said just in the last week that the NRA wants to kill children and
But
so forth.
but
So
but the idea of right after a tragedy like this, taking a national platform to say just things that I said it, like I said in my Facebook post, that LaPierre's either a fool or a knave. I would say they're really, with statements like that, it's hard for me to find another explanation, because those things are just patently false, and that's the kind of thing that drives me nuts. And has, I think there's certainly a role for the NRA, but I think that it's morphed. Certainly, if you look at the history of the organization, it's morphed from becoming an organization that I think supported gun rights, but also reasonable restrictions in the name of public safety, to being this just sort of all-out radical advocacy group that will brook no resistance. And I think it's just really gone off the rails. And the fact that he would say something like that, and it would be greeted with wild applause, just makes me want to despair.
well, let's put it in perspective though. This is Wayne LaPierre talking to CPAC.
And that makes it
Um,
okay.
no, I'm saying it makes it understandable that he's throwing red meat to the crowd. I mean,
Exactly.
that's, and
Exactly.
I'm not saying excusing it or saying that it's helpful. But I'm saying that those are big applause lines that he knows he's going to get in front of that audience. That being said, I think you can also make the argument that there are plenty of folks out on the left who very much want to ban guns. And that's not to say they don't care about kids. I think, but I think you can make the argument that look, it's every time one of these things happen, um, you have the same voices jump up and say ban guns, and they're the same voices that always ban guns, and there is sort of the sense of uh, are they trying to take this tragedy to advance their policy goals? Now,
Well, of course they are, and that happens on both
yeah,
sides.
and it does, but I mean, I think what I'm saying is that I think you can look at it as that, which is um, again certainly not laudable, um, but it's different than saying the other side hates kids, wants kids to die, that sort of thing.
Okay. I also, it seems like one thing that always happens is after one of these tragedies is that the NRA and other folks say, well, you know what the answer is? The answer is more guns. And President Trump seems to have embraced this solution, wanting to arm, a bunch of teachers. And of course, this surprised me on a number of levels. Well, really, I guess it really didn't surprise me, because Donald Trump has a penchant for just saying the first
He's a
idea that,
surprising guy.
yeah,
Yeah.
comes to mind. Number one, I'd say this is certainly not a very conservative idea, and that it kind of goes against the whole idea of federalism and local control. And if you ask school boards and schools and so forth, they say, my God, that's the last thing we want to do. And a point I made earlier this week was, if you take a look at the incidence of school shootings, and I just did some real quick math. And if I have the math right, a student in K through 12 school has a 0.06% chance per year of being in a school with a school shooting, and a 0.00014% chance of being shot in one, whether it's being wounded or killed. And so my point here is that when we think about doing draconian things like hardening our schools or handing out a whole bunch of guns to a whole bunch more people to try to mitigate a risk that is already that small. What we know about risk mitigation is when your risk is that small, taking it from almost zero to zero is incredibly hard to do. And so anything that's likely to be even marginally effective at making that less likely is going to have huge unintended consequences. And I think that's, you point to the arming teachers. I can just off the top of my head think of a whole bunch of horrific or bad, at least, unintended consequences, which is why I think this idea isn't going to go anywhere, thankfully.
Well, first of all, I would say that's one of the most sensible things you've posted in quite a while. So congratulations. Second, I'm not sure what I agree with you on the unintended consequences thing and making the schools hard targets. That I think that's a problem, and there's a certain maturity that you got to realize that we live in a world where risk cannot be eliminated entirely, and that goes to all of these discussions of look. Again, the Columbine killings happened while there was an assault weapon ban in place, and high school kids who would have been underage and not allowed to buy guns anyway bought assault weapons, obtained assault weapons, and used them. So that's one of those examples of, look, you've got these laws in place that should prevent this, or ideally the left says would prevent this, but they don't. Likewise, I mean, I can go through all these different scenarios of sometimes it's, if you want to say, it's a lack of the regulatory structure working, or just plain human error or bad judgment. In this case, you had a situation where you had an armed security guard on the premises who waited outside. There's no way to legislate against that. Against that sort of thing. You had the FBI who had plenty of information. You had the sheriff's office who was given plenty of information, and nothing was done. And in those cases, maybe there are some legislative tweaks you can do if there was something that prevents the sharing of information. I don't believe that there was in this case. If there is some sort of legal or judicial tool that is needed in order to allow folks to seek to intervene. Okay, there may be some room there, but again, it's not something that you can just write a law and fix. So I agree with you on that. Now, as far as arming teachers or other school personnel goes, I think you're right on the idea of Trump's idea of the federal government is going to arm the teachers. Sounds sort of goofy, but I think local school districts should take a look at what can we do to have some armed presence at schools, whether that is a security guard, a sheriff's office, police officer, whether it's a teacher who's trained, a principal who's trained, it's several teachers or principals who's trained. I think that's a good idea. I mean, the idea is often mocked that the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, but there's also a lot of truth to good guys with guns do stop bad guys with guns, and also the idea that we recognize the imperfections in our system of preventing bad guys from getting guns.
Yeah, well, I think that's a statement that's half true. It's half true. What I mean by that is that you're right. In an instance, in the very rare instance of and tragic instance of a school shooting, I think President Trump pointed out the one teacher who charged the guy, and if he'd had a gun, he could have stopped it right there. But when you think, here's what people don't think about is to make that possible, enough people have to have enough guns, and while they might stop or mitigate the odd, rare school shooting, there are going to be those unintended consequences by having that many more guns out there in the population. There's nothing you can do about that. That's just how it is. And so I think that's one of those arguments that on the surface has a certain appeal, but when you think about it more, the risks, I would argue, far outweigh any potential benefits for that sort of thing.
I guess, but consider this though. I mean, we've created our schools. They have all these, the signs that say this is a gun-free zone. The people who are going in to shoot up the school are not going to pay attention to that sign. The innocent people, the law-abiding people, are. My sense is I think there should be the flexibility for local school districts to allow to change that so that people who are properly armed and trained can carry guns in schools if they so desire. So I mean, that's my thing where I see an issue of here's the government saying no, you can't protect yourself. We'll take care of this, and knowing that they can't, and that's what Trump was. So I think, and I'm not saying that all teachers ought to be armed, but I'm saying that option shouldn't be taken away from people who would seek to defend themselves or others.
Well, I think, yeah, and I think when school boards and others have sort of studied that, what they find is under tense situations, under very stressful situations, like when there is a shooter who's going around, killing people, what you find is even trained police officers, they shoot wildly off the mark an incredibly high percentage of the time, which makes sense because there's, adrenaline's pumping and people are moving around and so forth. And you can just envision all sorts of awful things happening. And, I think people get their sense of how this would work from TV and movies. And that's, not where you really want to get your sense of how this is. And thankfully, to this point, I think local school boards who've looked at this and you've talked to teachers unions and they say, well, God, this is the last thing we want. And so I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, I disagree with you on there. And I think that, again, this comes down to if you are in that situation, regardless of how good a shot you are, it's just would you rather have the gun or not have the gun? I'm saying, there's, again, if someone is, God forbid, coming into your school, your workplace, wherever, with a weapon and shooting people, are you going to think to yourself, boy, I'm glad I don't have a gun because I'm not that good a shot anyway. I probably just hurt somebody else. I think let's give them a fighting chance.
Well, I understand what you're saying. But of course, and as I pointed out before, the other side of that equation is the 99.99999% of the time where there isn't someone in there, but you still have another person with a gun. And what are the consequences of that? And we know there are consequences to that because we know certain things happen when more people have guns. And so you have to weigh that in the risk, in the cost benefit analysis. And I think too many people aren't looking at that part of the equation. All right, well, let's move on to, talk about weapons and concern about weapons. North Korea. Just before we wrapped up our prep for today's show, actually, the Trump administration announced a new set of sanctions against North Korea, which affect over 50 ships and transport companies in North Korea, China, and Taiwan, and are intended to further cut off revenue and also fuel for North Korea's nuclear program. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said, the president has made it clear to companies worldwide that if they choose to help fund North Korea's nuclear ambitions, they will not do business with the United States. And of course, this comes not long after the cancellation of a secret meeting scheduled between North Korean officials and Vice President Pence, who was in South Korea for the Winter Olympics, and who took some heat not long ago in the U.S. media for not standing to recognize the athletes of the Korean unified team. And people pointing out this from the same guy who walked out of an NFL game last season because some players refused to stand. So, Jay, any thoughts on this latest round of sanctions or Vice President Pence?
Good for Trump, good for Pence. Well done all around. We have talked about this. We keep passing sanctions against the North Koreans, and the problem is they are evaded by working through mostly the Chinese companies, and this is a step against those entities directly that should bear more fruit than what we've seen before. So I think that's a good step. This is, I think, Donald Trump being realistic. We have tried all these to accommodate the Chinese and work with the Chinese, and hey, you'll work with us on North Korea, and they either cannot or will not, and it looks more and more like they will not. So I think this is a good thing. Now, as far as Pence and the Olympics goes, once again, I say good for him, not accommodating a North Korean publicity stunt. And I know that the global media has of course fallen in love with Kim's darling sister, who this is there has always been this sort of dictator chic thing that the media buys into, and I've never understood it. But
I think that's a
the left
stretch with North Korea. But yeah, I don't think
Che Guevara posters.
Yeah, that's a big difference from the regime in North Korea. But go ahead.
Mrs. Assad on Vanity Fair.
This is a stretch. But go ahead.
No, the media's fallen in love with her, and it's a diplomatic coup, and the darling cheerleaders who's, I mean, God forbid one of them cheers at the wrong time, her family will be executed. I think it's good that Vice President Pence showed that sort of clear-eyed sort of sense of we're not going to be taken in by North Korean publicity stunts.
Yeah, well, I of course thought it was childish and pointless, but you'd expect me to say that, But as to the sanctions thing, I'm kind of of two minds here. I certainly agree that we've tried other approaches, and it just seems like we keep on getting played. And this has been under both previous Republican and Democratic presidents. But on the other hand, my concern, and I think a lot of people share this concern, is what happens when you push a regime like this up against the wall and give them no out, no alternative. I don't know that we're exactly doing that, but I can certainly see where this is a dangerous game. And, we've talked about this before. I don't think there are any good options. So I certainly understand the idea of trying something different. But of course, that comes with its own set of risks.
Yeah, I think the objective, look, I mean, I don't, will Kim bow to sanctions? Doubtfully.
Yeah. And that's my concern.
But are there, is there another general, other family members who would at some point say this is enough? And that's right. And they may be better or worse. Hard to imagine them being worse. But I think that figures in the calculations.
Yeah. It's like we've talked about it before. Like I said, there aren't a whole lot of there are no good choices actually in this.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, before we get to our next story, we'd like to thank our newest supporters. First, we have Matthew, Eva, Evan, and Joe, all of whom are helping us out with a regular monthly contribution through Patreon. And Joe,
thanks, guys.
Yep, we really appreciate it. And Joe wrote in, "Hey guys, I'm back on the platform. I'm giving Patreon a second shot. Keep up the hard work. Thank you." Next is Jared, who made a generous contribution to the show through PayPal. And he wrote in, "I'm just a poor, unemployed graduate about to enter the Army. I don't have much, but I'm a firm believer in supporting what you believe in. Thanks for setting a great example of how politics can be discussed." Well, thank you.
Well, thanks. And thanks for your service.
Absolutely. And when you make a pledge of financial support to this show, we would love to include a message from you in our shout out, like we just did with Jared and Joe. So if there's anything you'd like us to pass along, you can include your message in both Patreon and PayPal when you make that contribution, or you can just send us something at mail@politicsguys.com. And of course, now that we're ad free, listener support, it's what keeps the lights on. So if you'd like to join Matthew, Eva, Evan, Joe, Jared, and all of our other great Politics Guy supporters, go to Politics Guy. I can say our URL, politicsguys.com/support, or just go to the main page and you'll see on the menu, support the show. Thanks so much. All right, moving on. Jay, we've been talking a lot about gerrymandering of late. And this week, well, we're talking about it again in the wake of another important development. Pennsylvania's state Supreme Court, 5 of whose 7 members are Democrats, released its own congressional map after the Republican state legislature and the Democratic governor couldn't agree on a map of their own. And this all stems from a lawsuit filed by the League of Women Voters in which the court ruled that the current Republican-drawn map violated the state constitution and then ordered the legislature and governor to create a new map by February 15th. Now, the map drawn by the court splits far fewer counties and creates districts that are a lot more compact than the current map. And it also more closely reflects the overall partisan balance of the state. It creates 8 districts that were won by Clinton in 2016 and 10 that were won by Trump. Now, currently, 5 of Pennsylvania's 18 congressional districts are held by Democrats. As you might expect, Pennsylvania Republicans were not happy with this map, and it's likely to result in Democrats picking up somewhere between 2 and 4 seats in 2018 and holding them beyond if that holds. But their legal options, as I understand it, are limited because the U.S. Supreme Court has previously decided not to review the case, something we talked about a few weeks ago.
Right.
But some Republican legislators in the state are actually calling for impeachment proceedings against these judges. And if Republicans in Pennsylvania unite on this, they'd actually be able to do that because there aren't enough Democratic legislators to stop an impeachment drive. And President Trump chimed in with a tweet. He said, "Hope Republicans in the great state of Pennsylvania challenge the new pushed congressional map all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. Your original was correct. Don't let the Dems take elections away from you so that they can raise money, raise taxes, and waste money." So, Jay, what do you think about this?
Well, I've talked about this a number of times before, and I think the whole idea of a court drawing legislative maps is absolutely dreadful. I can list a whole lot of reasons. One being that's not a court's job. That's a political decision and not a judicial decision. Second, to the extent this is based on the Pennsylvania Constitution, and I'm not an expert on the Pennsylvania Constitution, but my sense is I don't think there is any sort of explicit right to have districts drawn as you might think, or as someone might feel are competitive or not competitive enough. It's just, to me, this is mind-boggling. It's a horrible precedent because what happens is from now on, every election is going to be subject to judicial review. Every map is going to be redone, not for the typical reasons that courts have allowed it, for example, racial discrimination, but to have some sort of uniform statewide, that the uniform statewide delegation reflects the state as a whole, and I don't find any that right anywhere in the U.S. Constitution. Now, again, I don't know that much about the Pennsylvania Constitution. Maybe they've got something in there that says that, but this is not the job of the courts to be redrawing districts. It is a political decision, and again, that's, maybe you don't like that, but that's how we decide things in democracies. And if we go down this route, again, you're going to see more of this turmoil of judges get in, rewrite the maps, legislatures try to impeach the judges. It's bad all around.
Well, I partly agree with you, actually. I think that courts should absolutely not be in the business of creating congressional maps. I think that's not their job. It is a political thing and not a judicial function. Where I differ from you is I think sometimes, as a last resort, if the court reasonably concludes that a map violates the Constitution and that the legislature, that the democratically elected representatives and are not correcting the problem, that they have a duty to step in, and certainly you and I might argue about what this right is and does it exist, whether it's in the Pennsylvania
right. Well, and
or the
again,
US
I guess
Constitution.
That what you just said sort of highlights my point. Is it's sort of the court decides if they think it's a problem, and
well, sure.
I guess that's what troubles me.
Well, I would say that's the job of a court.
The people aren't allowed to make up their mind. Well, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The Pennsylvania map, in and of itself, is not compared to other gerrymandering instances that we've looked at, is really pretty benign. And that's I think what's sort of troubling is, and there's always also, as we talked about, the way Pennsylvania is geographically, demographically, there's only so many ways you can split it up.
Yeah, but again, it's hard to ignore the fact that by pretty much any independent criteria, I mean, if you created these, if you didn't know which party was Democrats and which party was Republicans, this map by any sort of nonpartisan criteria makes so much more sense. I mean, from the very beginning, the whole idea behind congressional districting was that communities should be kept together and they should be compact and contiguous and so forth. And this map this is the kind of thing that rationally put together redistricting commissions or groups would do and should be doing. And that's why I say, you're right, and that the court shouldn't have to intervene. But when it gets so bad that it rises to the level of a constitutional problem, then the courts have to step in. And I'm going to make an analogy, and you're going to disagree with it in part, and that's okay. But
Okay.
it reminds me, not nearly to the same extent, but where the courts had to step in to say, hey, listen, congressional districts have to be roughly the same number of people, which wasn't always the case. There used to be these, some districts would be really small and some would be really large. And so representation was obviously skewed by that. Now,
Sure. One man, one vote. Yes.
exactly. Now, this doesn't rise to that. I'm not
No offense. No
suggesting
offense
that.
to women, but
Well,
that was
yeah.
that was how they framed it. But go ahead.
It's not that Jay had the chance to say person and decided to say
Yes.
man because he's a sexist.
That was historically
he's
what
a sexist
happened.
for other
Yes.
reasons. Maybe no, you're
Yeah.
not, Jay. But and so that's how I see it. And I think that's where our fundamental disagreement and the fundamental disagreement between the left and the right. And on the left, my concern is the horrible precedent that's being challenged is, well, impeach these judges because they reached the decision you don't like. That to me is very disturbing. Now, I don't think it's actually going to go through, so maybe it's more talk than anything at this point, but just the fact that we've sort of normalized this type of talk bothers me.
Well, I think that the impeach these judges, it's not necessarily impeach these judges because they've reached a decision we don't like. It's impeach these judges because they have exceeded their judicial authority and assumed a legislative role. I agree. It probably doesn't get that far. Impeachment of judges, regardless on grounds, any other grounds other than serious personal malfeasance, is pretty rare. So I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah.
All right. Well, there was a new development very late this week in the Robert Mueller investigation of Russian influence in the 2018 election. Additional charges were filed against former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort, as well as his business partner and fellow Trump campaign official Rick Gates, who pled guilty to 2 counts and will cooperate with prosecutors. Now, there's a 32-count indictment, and it claims that the two obtained millions of dollars through fraudulent loans and tax cheating in a multi-year scheme. And then late on Friday, a new indictment came down alleging that Manafort secretly paid a group of former top European politicians millions of dollars to take positions that were favorable to his client, Ukraine, including by lobbying in the United States. So Jay, it seems to me that these charges, while, very extraordinarily serious, aren't directly related to Russian influence over the election, though I guess there might be some indirect influence through Ukrainian connections, maybe. But as our resident attorney on the show, what's your sense of why Robert Mueller brought these additional indictments?
My sense is because he doesn't have anything else. This is, again, has nothing to do with the election. This is all conduct that occurred before the election and relates to money laundering, and in some cases, failing to fill out the foreign agent forms, which, again, it's illegal. It's bad. You shouldn't do it. But it doesn't have anything to do with Donald Trump. It doesn't have anything to do with Russians trying to influence our election. It doesn't have anything to do with collusion, other than if you want to try to connect the dots and say, well, Manafort knew these Ukrainians who knew these Russians, and Manafort knew Trump, therefore there's collusion. Again, that's a pretty far stretch. With the new indictment of the I'm forgetting his name now, Manafort's Gates, sort of partner underling. Again, these are essentially money laundering charges, bribery charges. But
this is pretty standard, right? I mean, when you think that somebody has information that might be useful in your primary target, your primary investigation, you file some charges and get them to cooperate and hope they roll on the people and give you the information you need. So that to me seems to be what a lot of people are arguing is going on, as opposed to, well, he has nothing, he just needs to file something, but he thinks that there actually is something there directly related, but he needs to get to it by going through these people for their other illegal activities. Because otherwise, what leverage does he have?
Well,
say, well,
but here's
please,
the thing.
will
So Gates is pleading guilty to testify against Manafort for further again, malfeasance prior to the election that's not related to Donald Trump. Um, Again, I don't see the connection yet. I mean, I suppose there are the folks who go, "Oh, he's on to something." But I don't see it. And I'll say it was a little unfortunate. After the Russian indictments, the 13 Russian trolls, as it were. You and I both had the week off, so we really didn't get to talk about that. But to me, again, this struck me as if you're not sort of what the 13 Russians are essentially charged with were, sort of making statements to, inflame American passions and get people mad at each other on Facebook and in social media, which that's pretty much what everybody on social media does every day.
Yeah, but the way they did it was illegal. I mean, it's not like, I think you're minimizing it.
That's exact. No, let me tell you, minimizing it. What they're being charged with is they did this stuff and they didn't file as foreign agents.
Well, yeah, that's significant.
Well, so what I'm saying is the crime is sort of, if they had filled out the right paperwork, it would have been legal. And the FBI and Mueller has spent so much time, so much money on this, and it's.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm really glad you brought that up because I'm hearing this a lot, right? This investigation is dragging on forever. But if you look historically, it's actually moving incredibly fast compared to similar investigations in the past. I mean, these things typically take several years, even before the first indictments are out. And, 4 or more years to wrap up entirely. You take a look at, for instance, Whitewater, lasted over 6 years, and so if you look at it in context, I know maybe it's because these days we expect everything to happen so quickly, but everyone should have known. Well, maybe not everyone should have known, but I think it was obvious to everyone who's had any knowledge of how these things work that this wasn't going to wrap up in a year or 2 years. That's not how these investigations happen. So he hasn't spent a ton of time or money historically speaking. It's just not the case.
All right. Well, sure. I mean, and again, it brings to mind Patrick Fitzgerald's investigation. He was, of course, appointed by Mueller to suss out who leaked the identity of Valerie Plame. Turns out Fitzgerald discovered that information 3 months into the investigation, and yet dragged it on for another 3-4 years, eventually getting a conviction, which was.
The Valerie Plame story was not just short of 3 years. Yeah.
Yeah, which to my mind was someone was charged with misremembering or having a different memory of something than another witness who was dead and couldn't be cross-examined. So, but more to my point is, if this is what we're looking at, if this is the Russian, the crime is being a troll on social media. Something which, if done by an American citizen, would be perfectly legal, protected by the First Amendment, and encouraged in many quarters. It strikes me that this is a colossal waste of time.
And I agree. I agree. If that's all there is, you're absolutely right. If nothing more than this comes of it, then there's not a whole lot of there, big nothing burger, as they say. But I guess my point is that this is still very early days, and it's not at all outside of the realm of possibility. I would say it's even fairly likely that these are just opening stages of something far larger that Robert Mueller's trying to put together. And we'll see how that happens. And so I guess my point would be, just in general, people are probably tired of me saying this, right? But that it's difficult to judge these things until more comes out, and we really kind of have to wait and see. I think we're not going to get a sense of whether this was a worthwhile investigation for at least a couple more years, and that's maybe a minimum. But that's just the nature of the beast.
I think the couple more years is a little far fetched, and I completely agree with. Oh no, do I think the Mueller will try to drag this out for a couple more years, investigating every financial transaction Donald Trump has ever been involved in? Sure, whether it relates to Russians or whomever. But I don't know that the American people are going to have the appetite for it. And second, I agree with you that we ought not to jump in and make judgments hastily on these sort of things, and let's see where the investigation leads. But I also think it's entirely appropriate to look at where the investigation is and comment on it as it moves along.
Sure. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
if this is what we've got so far, I'm not seeing the big there just because I'm not sure who. Uh,
Yeah, I hear you. That's a
again,
fair point.
who's the witness that we're trying to get to turn? And again, maybe we just don't know. Maybe there's somebody out there who's really got something really damning. But I'm not seeing it at this point.
No, and no one's seeing it at this point, and so the question remains: is it there to be seen? So
Right.
maybe in episode, I don't know,
But you're
437,
saying
we'll look back.
we'll just keep looking. We'll just keep looking for another 5 years because it's got to be there because it's
Well,
Trump.
no, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying it's got to be there. I'm saying that as long as the investigation stays within its purview that was laid down under the original charge, then that's perfectly legitimate. And so I guess the matter becomes, to what extent do you think that Robert Mueller's long history of what most people thought was very dedicated service to the country and impartiality and all that, which even a lot of most Republicans were saying when he was appointed,
At the time, yeah,
is that
yeah.
who he is, or is he a partisan hack who's out to get the president? As now a lot of these same people are saying. I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. So, all right. So it's time for What We're Reading, where we step back and, talk about some of the more in-depth, thoughtful things we're reading, listening to, or watching. Jay, do you want to start us off this week?
I will, and this one goes out to all the haters who say I'm so predictable. This is a movie I happened to catch on Turner Classic Movies a couple weeks ago because I'm a huge Turner Classic movie fan. But the movie is The Times of Harvey Milk, and it's a 1984 documentary about Harvey Milk, who was the first, if not the first, one of the first openly gay politicians in our country in San Francisco. And he was murdered in, I want to say, 1977. Anyway, the documentary it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm certainly someone who wouldn't agree with Harvey Milk on a lot of politics, but he comes across as a honest, decent guy, and this is all footage from the time, and it's also fascinating again to see the way the world was 40 years ago. That how attitudes have changed, and it's there's also some great sort of cameos by. At that time, City Councilwoman Dianne Feinstein, who discusses, and they talk about her need to carry a gun for safety, which is I absolutely love. And if you don't know the story, also, I mean, Milk was killed along with the mayor of San Francisco by another city councilman. So it's I don't want to. Hope I didn't spoil it, but. No, I mean, and again, I think there's also some fascination to look at because I wasn't really that familiar with the intricacies of the story. Again, I knew who Harvey Milk was. I knew he had been killed, and often he's set up as sort of a martyr to gay rights. He was killed because he was gay. But you watch the movie, and I don't come away with that. I mean, it seems it was much more of a personal. A situation. But anyway, that would be my recommendation. And I don't know if they're going to be re-showing it on Turner Classic Movies this month. If not, it is available on Amazon Prime.
Yeah, I haven't seen that yet.
Didn't see that coming, did you?
No, I did not. I did not. I also haven't seen the Times of Harvey Milk, but I did see, and I actually used it in my class, one of my classes back a while ago, the fictionalized version of that story, Milk with Sean Penn. Yeah, it was a very interesting, great movie. I enjoyed it a lot, so I might have to put this on my list as well. I'm a fan of TCM as well. So my choice this week, well, there's an article I read I thought was really fascinating called Who Needs Congressional Districts? And a lot of people don't know this, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says we actually have to have congressional districts. And at the very beginning of the country, in fact, a lot of states didn't have districts and elected members of the House at large. And that really changes a lot of how representation might work. And so this article is really sort of a fascinating history, and just it makes you think in a different way of I think, of things that you just assume, well, that's just how it is and how it has to be. So it's not something that's going to happen. We're not going to change from a single member district or anything like that. I don't expect that to happen, but I thought it was fascinating, if nothing else, for sort of a history lesson as to how this came about. So I'm recommending that. Also, I wanted to, not so, well, I guess it's what I'm reading. A while ago, I guess about 3 weeks ago now, I normally, my main news source is the New York Times. I mean, I read a bunch of other things. I read the Wall Street Journal, a whole bunch of sources, but I always start with one kind of paper that I base things off of. And for years, it's been the New York Times. Well, about 3 weeks ago, I had some weird idiosyncratic problem with my laptop, and the New York Times site was not displaying correctly. Like, it hated my laptop. I don't know. So I switched to the Washington Post, and it's really kind of fascinating because it's some of the same stories, but the switch gave me a sense of kind of how these two main news sources for from the left, I guess you would say, cover the news. And I got to say, I'm really glad for this computer problem, which has since been solved, because I've actually found the coverage in the Washington Post to be deeper and better than what I was getting from the New York Times. And so I have switched to the Washington Post as my main political news source, and I'm very happy that lucky accident happened. So I wanted to pass that along.
All right. Well, I mean, gosh, I mean, that's talk about mixed feelings for me. I mean, I suppose I'm always happy to hear the New York Times loses a subscriber.
Oh no, I still subscribe.
There you go. Oh,
I still subscribe. I subscribe to both.
Loses a reader.
I subscribe to the Washington Post, New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. I want to keep that sort of great journalism alive and going, so I do what I can. And also, I should point out that the Washington Post has by far the best major media motto: "Democracy dies in darkness." How can you not love that? I mean, that's just great. Anyway, okay, that's it for this episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We hope you liked what you heard. Listener support is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. So if you'd like to help us out, go to politicsguys.com/support. That's the direct link. Or you can just go to politicsguys.com and go to support in the main menu. And subscribing to the show, that also really helps, as does sharing episodes. Whether you share it to say, you should definitely check this out, it was a great episode, or, oh my God, Jay is just insane.
We get a lot of that.
Yeah, or anything in between, really. And it's easy to do right in your podcast app. There's that little share symbol. Just click on the triangle thing, and there you go. And because word of mouth really is our best advertising. And leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also does help. So if you want to get in touch with us, well, you probably know how to reach us. mail@politicsguys.com. There's also our Facebook page where you can message us, and where we post stuff throughout the week. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.